Today we're going to show you how we filled knots, voids, and checks with 3 different epoxy products, cyanoacrylate, and how we choose which one to use.
So the first one that we're going to talk about is a piece of Brazilian hickory. It's got some wormholes or bug holes in it, as well as some tiny little pinholes. We're going to fill this one with Acfix E350 5-minute epoxy. We're going to prep the back of this board. We're gonna take a roll of tape and we're gonna prep the back so that we make sure that none of the epoxy seeps through. So the first thing I'm gonna do is seal off this side where there's a nice big crack.
You want to avoid any wrinkles or ripples because then the epoxy is gonna fill in there, potentially leak out. Looks good to me.
How's that Christmas present? One of the things that I didn't really realize about epoxy is the exothermic reaction. As it starts to heat up, it thins out the epoxy. So you can have something that doesn't leak for the first hour of your pour or whatever.
But hour 2 or 3 is the risky time.
Liquid. You have to be careful with staining with anything that has a liquid pigment in it.
Yep.
So you've got to do a little pre-treatment if you're going to use a black one. I'm going to use the clear. We're going to get that mixed up quickly and we'll apply it to the board. I'm just going to go ahead and tear off a piece of cardboard and mix on top of that. Going to make sure that our cardboard is clean. Blow any dust off of it that might be on there. Jesus. Depress the plungers. Grab a popsicle stick. Make sure it's a popsicle stick that ends with an X, not a CK.
That's plural, isn't it? Yeah. Sticks.
X is, yeah, that's the plural of single popsicle stick. It's got a milky look to it. As I start to mix this up and get both parts integrated together, it's going to start to clear out a little bit for me. And that's kind of when I know that it's...
You kind of get that cloudy mix, and then as you mix, it kind of goes to that clear point, and that's when you know it's thoroughly mixed. 5-minute epoxy, how long do you normally mix for before you...
I mix for maybe a minute or so.
But you don't want to push that too long because it's going to start to thicken up, and we want that to get right in there. Kind of time is a factor on this one.
It is. So you'll notice that this is a little bit thicker, kind of like honey. You can't really pour this stuff. And I'm going to kind of smear it and press down, coming from one side, to make sure I'm trying to press down as much epoxy into those voids as possible. My second choice on this, honestly, probably would be CA glue.
Yeah.
You could go with a UV epoxy or something similar, but I would probably go with a CA glue. There are some CA glues out there as well that have different viscosities.
You could also use UV on this if you got the time to wait. It'll soak in a little longer, a little deeper because of the slower cure versus a 5-minute or a CA. The one main thing to factor in is a lot of epoxies are volume based. A lot of people think it's like depth based, but it's always about volume. So if it's a smaller volume, the epoxy will take longer to cure versus a larger volume because you don't get the same exothermic reaction in those thinner areas. It doesn't heat up as much, which causes that faster cure.
Right.
And then it looks like some of these have sunk a bit.
I'm going to fill all the holes first, and then I'm going to go back to the beginning
Do
and
a once over.
Kind of do a once over all the way through.
If you're good, you'll just give it a light pass and you won't melt anything. So you can use a torch, like a heat gun. Heat gun's a little more safe. Quick light passes. You don't want to, have the flames right on the actual epoxy. A lot of times you'll actually visibly see the bubbles popping and the epoxy settling a little bit as it thins out from the heat.
Now you can take some of the excess from the edges of the hole, push it back over the top.
Kind of skim it right over the top.
Kind of skim it right over the top. And I know some of this looks a little bit ugly right now, but if I go back with my heat one more time,
it'll kind of
help relax it.
You're 5 minutes in.
Stuck. 5 minutes in. That's how quickly it's beginning to set up and cure.
Not solid, but not workable if you're not done.
Yeah, not workable. Take a sewing needle or a little piece of thin wire, anything like that. It's almost as if there's like a little airlock or a little air seal inside of those holes. Poke down through your epoxy and kind of pop that little air bubble that's trapped there.
Yeah.
It'll allow it to flow down into your channel.
Basically break the seal, let the epoxy seep in so you don't have air trapped in it, which could be exposed when you sand, because if you sand off that layer, you expose air, and now you're back to square one where you got to fill again. Next up, we're going to tackle these checks and cracks, and some of them go right to the end, so we're going to show you how we address that. What do you want to use for this?
There's a couple of different products that you probably could use. This end check is big. It goes all the way through the board, so it's an inch thick. Probably the best product for this, because of that particular piece, is going to be our UV epoxy from Epoxy. Because that goes all the way through it, it's an end check that's potentially going to be visible. I want to make sure I get good penetration. These
checks are naturally going to want to open up more over time.
Correct.
So if you don't have a good epoxy in there that goes all the way through and attaches to both sides, it'll likely want to split further down the road. The UV epoxy will penetrate, get in there, and have sort of like 100% connection on both sides to prevent that check from opening up. The bottom of this board was fairly smooth, so the tape is going to attach fairly well. Up top here, you just kind of leave that guy loose, let the epoxy kind of run up to it.
I leave it high just to create just a tiny little dam. Do you know what the line is? It 1 ounce, 2 ounces? Is that what this is?
I don't think those lines mean anything.
I always err on the side of more resin as opposed to less resin.
Sometimes the hardener or the resin will kind of stick to the outside, and you want to make sure that you get that full mixture in.
Same process. I'm going to take the popsicle stick. You'll notice this is maybe a little thinner than honey. Press and rub it into the cracks. I find that starting at one end of the crack and pressing your way towards yourself or away from yourself, you kind of push the epoxy in. If you just cover it quickly, it never penetrates the crack.
If you just poured along that crack, like right on top of it, you would ultimately trap air in, and that air wouldn't be able to escape. Another thing you could do on the wider ones is pour right next to it and kind of let it seep down the one side and flow in. It takes a little longer, which you can do with this epoxy because you've got that pot life. But for these smaller ones, I think you need to physically help get it in there.
Push it in there. You may be air bubble free for 2 hours with some projects, and then all of a sudden you get air bubbles to start appearing from the surface as they release from the bottom of your piece to the top.
Which is why it's important to babysit the piece for 1 to 2 hours after to catch some of those things so you don't come in the next day to a partial failure, you know?
Correct.
Why don't we come back to this one in about 10 minutes and we'll touch it up. It's a 24-hour epoxy, so normally by the next day, it's not like the full 24 hours. You could check it with your thumbnail, but you could sand that normally 12 to 24 hours later. On to the next one.
This piece of aromatic cedar's got a nice big void in it. Great for character of your finished piece. A little bit of a pain in the tail to deal with from a maker perspective, so you've got to make sure you're handling this one right.
You can't just use a 5-minute epoxy or any old epoxy to fill this. There's certain epoxies. So what would your go-to be for this guy?
Probably stick with SPR for this one, but you might be able to get away with UV epoxy on it as well. But summertime, there's no possible way I would pour either one of these with UV epoxy.
No.
Now that softness of the wood and that punkiness here where you can kind of get your fingernail in, if you use something that's a longer cure epoxy, it's going to soak into that wood, make it nice and hard, and you're not going to have to deal with that long term. I'm probably going to use a few different tools. I'm going to take a dental pick, a small chisel, screwdriver, and I'm going to try and clean up as much of those small fragments, things that are going to get in and muck up my epoxy, and make sure that none of that is left to float in my epoxy.
We can see how much stuff came out of there. You'd never suspect that based on just looking at it. Next up, I would hit it with a wire brush, and then you could also lightly hit it with a torch if there's any sort of like fibrous hairs inside of there.
It's 2 to 1, right? Right.
Yeah, 2 to 1. Sound like enough?
No, but
We're gonna go with SPR here. Open up a fresh 6 liter. We have 4 liters and a 2 liter of hardener. It's a 2 to 1 mixture. We'll mix that by volume using one of these measuring cups.
I think we need 12 ounces.
We do that in Canadian units.
They're not Canadian. They're Canadian. 350 mils. These are child-proof, so can you help me?
Now we're gonna add a 2-part. We're doing 12 ounces, so you've already poured in 4 ounces. Correct. We're gonna add 8 ounces.
If I were a beginner trying to pour epoxy first, I would want to pour clear. I get to see how well I've mixed up my epoxy, whether I have streaks and all those things.
Trapped air bubbles, which you're not gonna see with color.
Any of those things. What I should do though, is I should probably tape the bottom of this before we pour it. Boom, that one's done. Should we prep this one next?
Let's prep this one so we pour all at once.
Okay, terrific.
Now this one's gonna be a little different because of our live edge there. So there's gonna be a bit of a challenge there. How would you address this? I know I would personally try to sand that down, get a little smoother edge so our tape has something to attach to.
Without question.
This also has some roughness on the bottom. I would maybe smooth that out a touch. I mean, luckily we're gonna get enough tape adhesion. And then I would also probably pick away some of that stuff. So why don't you prep that up and then we'll be ready to pour.
Perfect.
Ultimately, we're just trying to remove any loose particles that can float in the epoxy.
Also going to sand the top and bottom of this again. You get the char around the edges, which typically wouldn't be a big deal. However, the epoxy can help set that in. It's best just to kind of get that char off the top surface.
Clear it off now so it's not a problem later.
Correct.
Tape on the bottom, band that kind of runs that way. Up the side, a second or a third one. The pressure of the epoxy, once it's settling in there, is going to be pushing on that tape, and you just don't want to create like a big bubble there or get a leak. Multiple layers is kind of the key here.
One of the things I'm going to deal with is this little hole here in the middle.
Oh, with the,
pour
I
it.
forget what that's called.
Yeah, what is that called?
Eric will Google it and add it in the text right here.
It's the little channel that's got fins in it. I would typically let this off gas for 10 or 15 minutes, kind of let some of those air bubbles
In
release
theory,
themselves.
it'll off gas in there as well. One question we get a lot is, can you use this epoxy for the really small cracks and stuff, or do you need to switch to a different kind of epoxy to fill those little voids? Which you can use this for all the little voids. So, you know, while we're addressing this, we may as well address that. That's full. That little check.
there.
You may as well address it all at once, because you're going to wait for this to cure anyways, and there's no point in wasting other product.
Now, if I have some of this thin set epoxy left, can I pour a table with it?
Absolutely not.
Why?
So yeah, you don't want to use this for thicker pours, such as larger river tables, think coffee table, dining table, conference table. When this kind of epoxy is poured in larger volumes, the exothermic reaction will bubble, smoke, probably melt your form. It'll basically be a huge waste for the whole project. You'll want to switch over to, say, an Epoxy Flowcast, not the SPR, for bigger projects. Not all epoxies are created equally, so really be selective in what you're picking. Now you can already see bubbles releasing there. We'll let that hang out for a bit, 15 minutes before we come back and, you know, torch it and see if it needs a top up.
The old dental pick here and give it a little pokey poke. And that's the proper scientific term. Kind of trying to move some of the air bubbles out of the way. And yeah, as we've come back to this piece here that we poured with our UV epoxy, you'll notice that this crack is completely empty. Get rid of any of those air bubbles and air voids.
Plus that torch will kind of soften the epoxy a little bit and make it a little more runny to get into those voids.
Now I'm not necessarily pushing it down in the cracks now because it's kind of already run down in most of these cracks.
This is more of just the top up. This is part of the babysitting process. We've already topped this up a second time, hitting it with a torch a second time. We'll check on it again in 10 minutes. We'll hit this guy with a torch, this guy with a torch. Looks like there's some surface bubbles.
The nice thing about SPR from Epoxy is that like this thing is air bubble free and we didn't pre-treat it at all. And it is crystal clear. By far, this is my favorite one to use.
So you can see here how this epoxy is settled. Just it's absorbing into the wood and filling in all the little voids. This is about 15 minutes later, and we're gonna top this up just with some more SPR. We'll overfill it a little bit because we assume it's gonna absorb a little bit more, and this may be just the right amount so that it doesn't sink to below the surface. Next up, we're gonna talk about CA glue and how we're gonna address a few of these knots and voids. We're actually gonna knock out that little piece, that little knot. Sometimes when you leave a knot like that, it will float in the epoxy and then it becomes kind of more challenges, spot for air pockets and bubbles. Really, it's user preference. This is not even 5 minutes. This stuff is pretty much instant. Let's get to it.
We knocked out that that knot that you talked about. So to me now, that's too big to fill with CA glue.
So this won't work, but we'd probably use a UV epoxy for that, or even the SPR if you got one or the other open. But this knot is a perfect candidate for this product.
Perfect candidate.
So how does this work?
Science?
No, like just do it. Pour it in. So this product, we're just gonna drop a bunch of drops in there, and the knot goes all the way through, but because this is gonna get sprayed and cure instantly, we're not worried about taping the back. What we'll do is we'll do our few drops, spray it, and then we'll flip it over, and there may be some sort of unsprayed product close to the bottom. We're just gonna give it a quick spray.
So the stuff's a little bit thicker, thick like honey. So I kind of rub it in again.
This knot here is where we're drawing the line of almost too big, if not too big.
Just trying to work that CA glue down into this hole in this crack.
That's more than enough, that's plenty.
Now that those are all sprayed on top, check my bottom side of this knot. Spray that in case there was any glue that came through the bottom.
Let that hang out for maybe 3-4 hours.
Right.
See until you can't put your fingernail into it kind of thing, and then you're ready to sand.
If you're pressing on it, it feels firm all the way through, then you're ready to sand.
All right, guys, thanks for watching. Hopefully you got some value out of this video. Make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps us grow the channel. Let us know if you have any questions. We'll be happy to answer them.